Racist cop arrests 10-year-old black girl. Shocked to learn she's the police chief's daughter. Tiana Green grinned as she pushed off on her brand new bike, the wind rushing through her braids as she pedaled down the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willowbrook. Her father, Chief Marcus Green, had given her the bike just 2 days ago as a surprise for her 10th birthday, and she had been riding it every chance she got. Today, she was venturing a bit further from her house, exploring the neighborhood's winding paths that snaked through her small Tennessee town. She felt free, confident, and entirely at ease, until she noticed a police car slowly approaching. The cruiser pulled up beside her, and Tiana's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the officer driving. It was a woman she'd seen once or twice in town, Officer Lydia Tanner. Lydia had recently transferred to the neighboring Willowbrook Police Department, but Tiana had never had any reason to talk to her, until now. She slowed her bike, instinctively sensing that the officer wanted her to stop. "Hey there, young lady," Lydia called out, eyeing Tiana with a look that made her uneasy. "That's quite the nice bike you've got there. What's your name?" "Tiana, ma'am," Tiana replied politely, gripping the handlebars tightly. "Well, Tiana," Lydia said, drawing out her words as her gaze swept over Tiana's bike and then back to her face. "Where'd you get that bike? This doesn't look like something you'd pick up around here." Tiana's heart fluttered with confusion and a touch of fear. "My dad got it for me. It was a birthday present." "A birthday present, huh?" Lydia's tone sounded doubtful, almost mocking. "And where's your helmet?" Tiana felt her cheeks flush. I was just riding it around the neighborhood. I didn't think I'd need it for just a little ride." Lydia pursed her lips, an eyebrow raised. "Don't you know it's against the law to ride without a helmet?" she said sharply, though Willowbrook didn't have any such rule. "And do you have a permit to ride this bike?" Tiana blinked, thoroughly confused. "A permit?" she stammered, trying to make sense of Lydia's words. "Yes, a permit," Lydia said, her voice growing stern. "Especially if this bike isn't even yours." Tiana's fear grew into an uncomfortable knot. "But it is mine," she whispered, her voice wavering. "My dad gave it to me." "Don't get smart with me, young lady," Lydia snapped. "You think you're too good to follow the rules just because you're on this side of town?" Tiana felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know what she'd done wrong, but she knew one thing. She just wanted to go home. Tiana's heart raced as Officer Lydia Tanner narrowed her eyes, a look of skepticism that made her feel like she was guilty of something, though she hadn't the faintest idea what. She clutched the handlebars of her bike, wishing she could just turn and pedal away. "You say this is your bike," Lydia continued, circling her cruiser, so she was standing over Tiana, her arms crossed. "Yet here you are, out and about without any proof that it belongs to you." "But, I told you, my dad bought it for me," Tiana stammered, feeling smaller and more intimidated with every word. "It was a birthday present." She looked down, her words barely escaping her lips. Lydia scoffed. "A birthday present? On a bike like this?" Her tone dripped with doubt, and she took a step closer. "Are you sure you didn't just borrow it? Maybe without asking?" Tiana's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No, I'd never steal a bike." She tried to meet Lydia's eyes, hoping her sincerity would shine through. But Lydia's expression didn't soften. "I don't know, Tiana," Lydia said, tilting her head. "A kid like you, riding around on a bike that looks like it costs a small fortune? Out here in Willowbrook without a helmet, no permit, and no adult supervision." She shook her head. "Sounds a bit suspicious, don't you think?" Tiana's hands shook as she held onto the bike's handlebars. "My dad's okay with me riding here," she said quietly. "I don't need a permit, and I know I should have brought my helmet, but—" "Are you backtalking me?" Lydia interrupted, her voice turning icy. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "And no, I just thought—" Tiana's voice wavered, and she couldn't stop the tear that slipped down her cheek. Lydia's eyes narrowed. "That's enough," she snapped. "You're coming with me." She reached in her pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "No, please no. Just call my dad." Tiana's voice rose, but she forced herself to hold back her tears. "He's a police officer, too. He'll tell you this is my bike." Lydia raised her eyebrows, a smirk crossing her face. "Oh, is that right? Your dad's a police officer? And I suppose he's going to swoop in here and save the day." She laughed, a cold, condescending sound. Listen, young lady, I don't take orders from kids, especially kids like you. I'm not lying, Tiana insisted, a desperation in her voice she couldn't hide. Please, I haven't done anything wrong. Lydia's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, almost angry look. Well then, she said, snapping the handcuffs onto Tiana's wrists, ignoring her frightened gasp. If you haven't done anything wrong, I guess you won't mind coming with me until we get to the bottom of this. Tiana's breath hitched, her heart thundering in her chest as she felt the cold metal around her wrists. She looked around, hoping someone might see her and intervene, but the street was empty, and all the nearby houses were closed up tight. Can you please call my dad? She whispered, the words barely escaping her as Lydia led her toward the cruiser. Please. His name is Chief Marcus Green. Lydia stopped, her hand frozen on the door handle as she looked down at Tiana with an expression of surprise, quickly masked by a look of annoyance. Chief Marcus Green? She repeated, a glint of something unreadable in her eyes. So, you're telling me that your dad is the chief of police? Tiana nodded, her voice wavering. Yes, he'll come if you call him. But Lydia only shook her head, a hard, skeptical smile on her lips. You know what? I've had about enough of your stories. She pushed Tiana into the back seat and slammed the door, cutting off any hope that Tiana had of getting out of this nightmare. As Lydia walked around the car to the driver's side, Tiana's fear deepened, realizing her situation was only getting worse. The back seat of the cruiser felt cold and confining, a cage of steel and silence. Tiana sat, wrists bound and heart pounding, her thoughts whirling in a desperate, terrified blur. The scenery outside began to blur as the car sped up, leaving behind the quiet, familiar streets she had always called home. Officer Lydia Tanner sat in the front, her gaze fixed firmly on the road, her jaw set in determination. Tiana could barely see the officer's face in the rearview mirror, but every now and then, Lydia glanced back, her expression stern and unyielding. Each glance seemed to harden the officer's resolve, as if she were trying to convince herself that this young girl's fate was entirely justified. Tiana leaned forward as much as her handcuffs would allow. Please, Officer Tanner, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Just call my dad. He'll tell you this bike is mine. He's the police chief, and he can explain everything. But Lydia's eyes flicked up to the mirror, a cold smile crossing her lips. The police chief, she mocked, letting out a bitter laugh. Let me guess, your dad's also a lawyer, a judge, maybe even the mayor? She shook her head in disbelief. Do you really think I'm that gullible? Tiana's stomach churned. She couldn't understand why this woman wouldn't believe her, why she seemed so determined to see her as nothing more than a threat. Tiana swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. I know it sounds like a story, but it's true. His name is Marcus Green. Please, just check. Lydia's face tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Listen, kid, she snapped. Enough with your stories. I don't know what kind of household you grew up in, but where I come from, we respect the law. And kids don't just ride around expensive bikes like this without something fishy going on. Tiana blinked back tears. The officer's words were sharp and cutting, laced with a kind of anger that she didn't understand. She wanted to scream that she was telling the truth, that she hadn't done anything wrong, but fear kept her silent. As Lydia sped along the winding road out of Willowbrook, Tiana couldn't stop thinking about her dad. She knew he'd be home soon, probably looking out the window, expecting to see her riding back up the driveway with a big smile on her face. When he found her missing, he would worry, she was sure of it. Maybe he would call around, asking neighbors if they'd seen her, maybe even drive the streets himself, looking for his little girl. In the front seat, Lydia glanced down at the small display on her dash, where a flashing icon caught her attention. Her eyes flickered back to Tiana through the rearview mirror, a brief look of suspicion, as if she were beginning to wonder if there was some grain of truth to this girl's claims. But then she shook her head and turned the volume of the radio up louder, effectively blocking Tiana's small, trembling voice. Listen, Lydia said firmly, her eyes narrowing. We're going to drive to the station, and you're going to stay in a holding room until we get this sorted out. Maybe a little time alone will help you understand the importance of respect. Tiana bit her lip, her hands shaking in the cuffs. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, the world outside growing unfamiliar as they headed toward an unknown destination. She wanted to believe her father would find her, that he'd rescue her from this terrifying ordeal. But as the miles ticked by, hope began to feel as distant as the peaceful, quiet streets she had left behind. "Just please," she whispered one last time. "Please call my dad. Please." But her words were swallowed by the rumble of the engine and the unyielding silence of the woman in the front seat, her mind already set on a decision that could change Tiana's life forever. As the car came to a slow stop, Tiana's heart raced, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. They had arrived at a small, unfamiliar building nestled in a remote part of town. She didn't recognize anything around her, which made her feel even more lost. Lydia parked the cruiser and sat silently for a moment, fingers tapping against the steering wheel as she stared straight ahead. Tiana took a shaky breath. "Officer Tanner, please. I really didn't do anything wrong. Can you just call my dad? Just to let him know where I am." Lydia turned her head slowly, her eyes flashing with something Tiana couldn't quite name. It was a mix of irritation and something else, something darker. "Enough, Tiana," Lydia snapped. "You don't get to make demands here. You're a child, and from where I'm standing, you're a very suspicious child at that." Tiana's eyes filled with tears, her cheeks hot with fear and frustration. "But I don't understand. Why won't you believe me?" "Because I know what I see." "Tiana," Lydia said, stepping out of the car and moving to the back to open the door. "And right now, all I see is a kid who doesn't belong here, a kid with a bike that's probably worth more than my cruiser. And when I see that, I get suspicious." She reached in, grabbing Tiana's arm a little too roughly as she helped her out of the car. Tiana stumbled, the cuffs digging into her wrists, her vision blurring as she tried to keep her balance. Lydia led her to the door of the small building, her grip firm and unyielding. "Why are you doing this?" Tiana whispered, her voice barely a breath as she looked up at Lydia. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home." Lydia paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Tiana's. For the briefest instant, there was a flicker of doubt, a moment where the hardened expression softened ever so slightly. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that steely resolve. "Sometimes, kid," Lydia said coldly, "you've got to learn the hard way." She led Tiana inside, where the air was stale and the walls painted a dull, unwelcoming gray. Tiana's fear grew with every step, her mind reeling at how quickly an innocent bike ride had turned into this nightmare. She tried to hold back tears, forcing herself to be brave, to hold on to the hope that her dad would come for her. Lydia directed Tiana into a small room with a single chair and a table bolted to the floor. She gently pushed Tiana down into the chair, but the gentleness was overshadowed by the cold authority in her actions. Tiana watched Lydia's every move, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "Stay here," Lydia ordered, her voice sharp. "I'll be back once I've decided what to do with you." With that, Lydia stepped out, leaving Tiana alone in the cold, silent room. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time, Tiana felt truly alone, the reality of her situation sinking in like a heavy stone in her chest. She fought the urge to cry, swallowing hard as she remembered her father's words from just a few days ago, when he had given her the bike. "Remember, Tiana," he had said, his voice full of pride and love, "you are never alone. No matter where you are, I'm always just a call away." Now, that call seemed impossible, unreachable from this gray, lifeless room. But Tiana clung to the hope that her father would somehow sense she was in trouble, that he would come for her, like he always promised he would. Outside, Lydia leaned against the wall, her own heart racing. She felt a twinge of doubt, but quickly pushed it aside. She was sure she was right. This was just another kid who thought she could get away with something. But deep down, that flicker of doubt remained, haunting her thoughts as she tried to ignore the little voice telling her she'd gone too far. Inside the room, Tiana stared at the door, hope dimming with every passing second, and whispered to herself, "Daddy, please find me." Miles away, Chief Marcus Green was just finishing up his day at the station, preparing to head home. He glanced at his phone, expecting a message from Tiana, who often sent him a quick text when she got back from her bike rides. But today, the screen remained silent. Marcus frowned, chalking it up to a typical 10-year-old's distracted sense of time, and decided he'd just catch up with her when he got home. But as he slipped on his jacket, his phone buzzed. It was an alert from the family tracking app, a safety feature he'd set up for peace of mind, especially when Tiana was out alone. His brow furrowed as he noticed the location pin wasn't moving. It was fixed near the outskirts of Willowbrook in a remote part of town. This wasn't a spot she'd normally ride through. He dialed her phone number, but it went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like her. Tiana knew to always keep her phone on and accessible. A knot of unease formed in Marcus's chest as he refreshed the app and saw her location was still in that isolated area. His instincts flared up, and without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and rushed out of the office, ignoring curious glances from his colleagues. As he sped down the winding roads toward Tiana's last known location, Marcus tried to keep calm, but the knot in his chest only tightened. He knew the area well, a quiet, deserted stretch of town. If she was there, it couldn't be for a good reason. Meanwhile, in the cruiser, Tiana huddled in the back seat, her small body curled in on itself as Lydia's car sped along darkened roads. Tiana barely recognized the buildings and trees whizzing by, every passing minute making her feel more and more lost. The thought of her dad finding her seemed like a dream slipping further from reach. Up front, Lydia Tanner kept her gaze on the road, her face a mask of determination. But her fingers tapped against the steering wheel with a nervous rhythm, a telltale sign of her uncertainty. Every so often, her eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Tiana's terrified face. Despite herself, Lydia felt a pang of doubt creeping in. Had she overreacted? She pushed the thought aside, convincing herself that she was in the right, that she was keeping the neighborhood safe from trouble. But as she continued to drive, the creeping sense of guilt became harder to ignore. Tiana glanced out the window, trying to memorize landmarks, hoping for some clue as to where she was being taken. She knew her father always told her to stay aware of her surroundings, but with each unfamiliar street, her hope wavered. Finally, Lydia turned off the main road, pulling into a small, secluded parking lot behind a nondescript building. Tiana's heart leaped as she recognized the area from a school trip. It was close to an old and used precinct building that the town had recently shut down. Her father had told her about it, saying it was meant for storage now. But seeing it in the dim evening light made it feel eerie and wrong. Where are we?" Tiana asked, her voice a whisper as Lydia turned off the engine. "Just a place we can sit and talk without any distractions," Lydia said, her voice taut. She turned in her seat to look back at Tiana, her expression unreadable. "It's important you understand the consequences of your actions, young lady." "But I didn't do anything," Tiana pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to go home." Ignoring her, Lydia stepped out of the car, and for a moment, Tiana felt the crushing weight of helplessness. She wanted to scream, to shout, but her fear kept her silent. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "Dad, please find me." Outside, Marcus was speeding down the final stretch, his hands gripping the wheel with a force that left his knuckles white. His phone vibrated with a message from dispatch. They had located the last active cruiser linked to Lydia Tanner, and the coordinates matched Tiana's last location. Fueled by an intense blend of anger and worry, Marcus hit the gas, not stopping until he saw the lone cruiser in the secluded lot. His eyes scanned the area, his breath catching as he recognized his daughter's small face through the car window. Lydia, sensing his arrival, turned around, her eyes widening as she realized who had shown up. But before she could react, Marcus had already parked, stepping out of his car with a commanding presence that made Lydia's confident demeanor crumble. "Officer Tanner," he said, his voice a low, dangerous calm, "step away from my daughter's vehicle. Now!" Tiana's heart leapt as she heard her father's voice, her eyes filling with relief as she saw him approach. "Daddy!" she cried out, her voice cracking. Marcus held her gaze, his expression fierce and full of determination. "It's okay, Tiana. I'm here. He looked back at Lydia, his face darkening. Officer Tanner, we're going to have a conversation about what you've done here. But right now, you're going to release my daughter. Lydia stammered, momentarily at a loss for words, her face paling. Chief Green, I didn't know she was your daughter. I was just... It doesn't matter whose child she is, Marcus cut in, his voice sharp. She's a 10-year-old girl who was out for a bike ride. And now, because of you, she's terrified, handcuffed, and alone in the back of your car. Lydia took a shaky breath, reaching for her keys. I was only trying to keep the area safe. Marcus stepped closer, his presence towering. That doesn't excuse your actions. Now release her. I'll deal with your safety measures after my daughter is safe. Lydia, now visibly shaken, nodded, unlocking the cruiser and reaching into the back seat to uncuff Tiana. The moment she was free, Tiana leapt into her father's arms, holding him tightly as he wrapped his arms around her, murmuring reassurances. It's okay, Tiana, he whispered, smoothing her hair. You're safe now. I've got you. As he held his daughter, Marcus cast a final, disapproving look at Lydia, who stood frozen by the cruiser, understanding all too well that she had made a grievous mistake that would not be forgotten. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, Chief Marcus Green and his daughter Tiana sat in his police cruiser. Tiana was still visibly shaken, gripping the edge of her seat as she stared out the window, trying to absorb that she was finally safe. She had no idea how to start explaining everything that had happened, and her father, sensing her overwhelm, simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. They were parked in a safer, well-lit area not far from her home, giving Tiana time to gather her composure. Marcus gave her a gentle smile. Tiana, take all the time you need. I'm here. Tiana swallowed, nodding as she looked up at him. The comfort of his presence softened her fear, and she took a shaky breath, determined to explain everything that had happened. She didn't just want to be saved. She wanted her father to understand what Lydia had put her through. She stopped me because of my bike. Tiana began, her voice small but growing stronger as she spoke. She said it looked too expensive and that I needed a permit. She said I didn't belong here. I tried to tell her, Dad. I tried to tell her that you gave me the bike and that I wasn't doing anything wrong, but she wouldn't listen. Marcus's expression hardened, but he kept his voice calm and steady. And what did she say after that? Tiana looked down, her fingers nervously tracing the seams of the car seat. She said she didn't believe me. That kids like me, kids from the other side, shouldn't be here without permission. She didn't think you were my dad. And when I tried to explain, Tiana's voice cracked, her words trailing off into silence. Marcus took a deep breath, fighting to keep his emotions in check. Tiana, you were incredibly brave. You stood up for yourself, even when things felt so unfair. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. She glanced up at him, relief flickering in her eyes. I kept hoping you'd find me. I didn't know how you would, but I kept thinking about what you always tell me. And what's that? He asked gently, though he knew the answer. That I'm never alone, no matter what, she whispered. That you're always a call away. Marcus felt a pang in his chest. You did everything right, Tiana, and I'm sorry you had to go through that alone. Just then, a car pulled up nearby, and Officer Lydia Tanner stepped out, visibly nervous. She looked from Marcus to Tiana, the regret evident on her face as she wrung her hands. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he kept his composure for Tiana's sake. Chief Green, Lydia began, her voice subdued. I didn't know she was your daughter. I was just trying to do my job. Marcus straightened, his voice as sharp as steel. Officer Tanner, let's set one thing straight. It shouldn't matter if she was my daughter or anyone else's. Tiana is a child, and she was doing nothing but riding her bike. The fact that you saw her as a threat is something we need to address. Lydia looked down, her expression a mixture of guilt and frustration. I made a mistake. I see that now. I just thought. She paused, fumbling for words. I thought I was being cautious. Caution shouldn't mean targeting someone based on how they look or where they're from, Marcus said firmly. It's about keeping people safe and treating everyone with respect. What happened here tonight was wrong, and it's unacceptable. Lydia shifted her weight uncomfortably. I, I understand, Chief. I'll cooperate with any investigation. You're going to have to, Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. This isn't about punishment. It's about ensuring that what happened here doesn't happen again. Not to my daughter, not to anyone. Marcus glanced at Tiana, his gaze softening. Come on, Tiana. Let's go home. As they walked back to the cruiser, Tiana's hand securely in his, Marcus glanced over his shoulder at Lydia. Her head was down, her shoulders slumped, knowing her actions would be called to account. In the car, as they drove toward home, Tiana let out a long breath. The weight of the night's events began to lift as she realized that justice would be served and her father, true to his word, had been there when she needed him most. Thank you, Dad, Tiana whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. Marcus smiled, his voice tender. Always, Tiana. Always. Tiana and her father were finally back in the warmth and safety of their home, but the memories of the night's events were still fresh and raw. Marcus tucked Tiana into bed, sitting beside her to offer comfort and reassurance. But as he gently brushed a hand over her braids, he could see that the fear and confusion hadn't yet left her eyes. Dad, Tiana whispered, clutching the edge of her blanket tightly. Why did she act like that? Why did she think I was bad? Marcus took a deep breath, thinking carefully. Sometimes people let their fears and biases cloud their judgment, Tiana, he said softly. It's wrong, and it's unfair, but it happens. And that's why we have to keep speaking up when it does. Tiana nodded, but her brow was still furrowed. She kept saying that I didn't belong in the neighborhood, like I was some kind of stranger. I've never felt that way before. Marcus's chest tightened as he watched his daughter struggle to make sense of the night's ordeal. That's because you do belong here, sweetheart. No one gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't. As the night wore on, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that this was about more than one night, more than one mistake. It was about a responsibility he carried, not just as a father, but as a leader in his community. And he vowed to make sure that Willowbrook would be a place where his daughter, and everyone like her, could walk without fear. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over the Green family's quiet breakfast. Tiana picked at her cereal, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a somber silence. Marcus and Camille exchanged worried glances but kept the atmosphere light, hoping the familiar routine might ease the lingering tension. After breakfast, Marcus got ready for a meeting he'd requested with the police board and the mayor. The events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind, and he could feel a simmering resolve building with each passing minute. As he buttoned his uniform, he glanced over to see Tiana watching him from the hallway. Are you going to talk about what happened? She asked, her voice soft but determined. Marcus gave her a reassuring smile. I am, Tiana. I'm going to make sure that what happened to you is taken seriously. I'm going to make sure everyone understands that there's no room for that kind of behavior in our community. Tiana nodded, a hint of hope flickering in her eyes. Good. I don't want anyone else to go through that. You're absolutely right, Marcus said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. And that's why it's important that we talk about these things, that we don't let them get swept under the rug. Sometimes change takes time, but it starts by speaking up. Tiana smiled, her usual spirit returning, and Marcus felt a surge of pride. He knew this meeting was just one step, but it was a step he had to take for her, and for the entire community. A short drive later, Marcus arrived at the Willowbrook Town Hall, where the board members were already gathered, including the mayor, Eleanor Brooks, a longtime family friend who had known Tiana since she was a baby. Her face was serious as Marcus entered the room, and she gestured for him to sit, a gesture that conveyed both warmth and urgency. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Marcus, Mayor Brooks began, her tone respectful but resolute. I read the incident report, but I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened. Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts before he began. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for meeting on such short notice. I know this isn't easy to talk about, but it's something that can't be ignored. He explained the events of the previous night, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. As he spoke, he could see the expressions of the board members shift, some with anger, others with sadness. For many of them, the reality of prejudice in their community was an uncomfortable truth, but one they couldn't deny. When I arrived to find my daughter handcuffed and terrified, all because of a simple bike ride, Marcus paused, taking a breath to steady himself. I knew then that this was bigger than just one incident. This is about trust between our officers and the people we're meant to protect. And right now, that trust has been broken. The room fell silent as Marcus's words hung in the air, and Mayor Brooks nodded thoughtfully. What happened was deeply wrong, she said, her voice steady but filled with regret. No child, no person should ever feel targeted because of who they are or where they come from. We must take responsibility for this. One of the board members, a woman named Linda Patel, raised her hand. Chief Green, what would you suggest we do moving forward? How do we prevent this from happening again? Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm. It starts with training that addresses implicit bias and makes sure every officer understands the responsibility they have to treat all people fairly. But beyond that, we need accountability. Officers need to know that there are real consequences for behavior that crosses the line. The mayor nodded in agreement. I think it's time we make a statement to the community as well, something that assures them that Willowbrook is committed to safety and fairness. This isn't just about Officer Tanner. It's about making sure everyone knows where we stand. Marcus's chest swelled with gratitude. He had expected some resistance, but the board's commitment to change gave him hope that the community could, in time, heal and grow stronger. After the meeting, as Marcus walked back to his car, his mind was filled with both relief and determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy and change would take time, but he felt reassured knowing that steps were already being taken. Later that evening, as he shared the day's progress with Tiana, her face lit up with a smile. For the first time since the ordeal, he saw the lightness in her eyes return. Knowing he had taken action on her behalf, and on behalf of everyone else in their town, made her feel safe and valued. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered as they sat together. "Thank you for standing up for me." Marcus pulled her into a hug, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I'll always stand up for you, Tiana. Always." The next day, Tiana and her parents went about their morning routine, with Marcus preparing to head back to the station and Camille keeping a watchful eye on Tiana as she finished her breakfast. Though things felt calmer, a lingering unease remained. Marcus knew that, for Tiana's sake, he had to make sure the events from that night were fully addressed. And for that to happen, he needed one final conversation with Officer Lydia Tanner. By midday, Marcus arrived at the precinct. He had requested a private meeting with Lydia, who sat waiting in his office, her posture stiff, her gaze focused on her hands resting on her lap. As he entered, she glanced up, her face a mix of defiance and apprehension. She had heard about the meeting with the police board and the mayor, and she knew her career was at a crossroads. "Officer Tanner," Marcus began, his tone steady but serious, "I wanted to speak with you directly about what happened with Tiana." Lydia took a breath, her gaze meeting his, and Marcus could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just fear. "Chief Green, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I'm sorry for the way things turned out. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was only trying to do my job." Marcus let her words hang in the air before he responded. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Tanner, not to judge or assume based on where someone's from or what they look like." Lydia's face flushed, and she looked down at her hands again. "I didn't realize. I thought there was a threat. She was alone, and the bike looked expensive. I thought it could have been stolen." He raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "And did she ever show you any sign of being a threat?" "I read the incident report, but I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened." Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts before he began. "Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for meeting on such short notice. I know this isn't easy to talk about, but it's something that can't be ignored." He explained the events of the previous night, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. As he spoke, he could see the expressions of the board members shift, some with anger, others with sadness. For many of them, the reality of prejudice in their community was an uncomfortable truth, but one they couldn't deny. "When I arrived to find my daughter handcuffed and terrified, all because of a simple bike ride." Marcus paused, taking a breath to steady himself. I knew then that this was bigger than just one incident. This is about trust, trust between our officers and the people we're meant to protect. And right now, that trust has been broken. The room fell silent as Marcus's words hung in the air, and Mayor Brooks nodded thoughtfully. What happened was deeply wrong, she said, her voice steady but filled with regret. No child, no person should ever feel targeted because of who they are or where they come from. We must take responsibility for this. One of the board members, a woman named Linda Patel, raised her hand. Chief Green, what would you suggest we do moving forward? How do we prevent this from happening again? Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm. It starts with training. Training that addresses implicit bias and makes sure every officer understands the responsibility they have to treat all people fairly. But beyond that, we need accountability. Officers need to know that there are real consequences for behavior that crosses the line. The mayor nodded in agreement. I think it's time we make a statement to the community as well, something that assures them that Willowbrook is committed to safety and fairness. This isn't just about Officer Tanner. It's about making sure everyone knows where we stand. Marcus's chest swelled with gratitude. He had expected some resistance, but the board's commitment to change gave him hope that the community could, in time, heal and grow stronger. After the meeting, as Marcus walked back to his car, his mind was filled with both relief and determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy and change would take time, but he felt reassured knowing that steps were already being taken. Later that evening, as he shared the day's progress with Tiana, her face lit up with a smile. For the first time since the ordeal, he saw the lightness in her eyes return. Knowing he had taken action on her behalf, and on behalf of everyone else in their town, made her feel safe and valued. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered as they sat together. "Thank you for standing up for me." Marcus pulled her into a hug, his heart swelling with pride and love. "I'll always stand up for you, Tiana. Always." The next day, Tiana and her parents went about their morning routine, with Marcus preparing to head back to the station and Camille keeping a watchful eye on Tiana as she finished her breakfast. Though things felt calmer, a lingering unease remained. Marcus knew that, for Tiana's sake, he had to make sure the events from that night were fully addressed. And for that to happen, he needed one final conversation with Officer Lydia Tanner. By midday, Marcus arrived at the precinct. He had requested a private meeting with Lydia, who sat waiting in his office, her posture stiff, her gaze focused on her hands resting on her lap. As he entered, she glanced up, her face a mix of defiance and apprehension. She had heard about the meeting with the police board and the mayor, and she knew her career was at a crossroads. "Officer Tanner," Marcus began, his tone steady but serious, "I wanted to speak with you directly about what happened with Tiana." Lydia took a breath, her gaze meeting his, and Marcus could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just fear. "Chief Green, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I'm sorry for the way things turned out. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was only trying to do my job." Marcus let her words hang in the air before he responded. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Tanner, not to judge or assume based on where someone's from or what they look like." Lydia's face flushed, and she looked down at her hands again. "I didn't realize. I thought there was a threat. She was alone, and the bike looked expensive. I thought it could have been stolen." He raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "And did she ever show you any sign of being a threat?" Lydia sat in silence, her face pale. For a moment, Marcus thought she might offer an apology, but instead, she shook her head, a trace of bitterness in her voice. "Maybe I made a mistake," she muttered. "But with everything that's happened in the world, we can't be too careful." "Careful doesn't mean prejudiced," Marcus said, his tone unyielding. "It doesn't mean treating a 10-year-old girl like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin or the neighborhood she's in." Lydia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Marcus could see the struggle on her face, the conflict between her defensive instincts and the uncomfortable realization that her actions had crossed a line. "Officer Tanner," he continued, his voice softening slightly, "this isn't just about my daughter. It's about making sure that everyone in this town, Every child, every parent feels safe and respected by the people who are supposed to protect them. You have a choice now. You can take responsibility for your actions, learn from them, and help make this department better. Or you can ignore it and keep making the same mistakes. Lydia's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of remorse, a realization that perhaps her actions had been rooted in something far deeper than simple caution. She swallowed, her voice quiet. I didn't mean to hurt her. I thought I was doing the right thing. Then show it, Marcus said, his tone firm. Own up to what happened, apologize to Tiana, and commit to doing better. That's the only way forward from here. Lydia nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling on her. I understand, Chief. I'll, I'll do what's necessary. As Marcus rose to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at her. And remember, Officer Tanner, everyone deserves respect. Until we start giving it, we can't expect our community to trust us. I hope you'll take that to heart. With that, he left, his mind focused on what lay ahead for his department. Change was rarely easy, but in that moment, he knew it was both necessary and inevitable. And as he returned to his office, a sense of resolve filled him, a promise that he would fight to ensure Willowbrook would be a place where everyone, including Tiana, could feel safe and valued. Tiana sat on the couch, wrapped in a cozy blanket as she listened to her dad recount his morning meeting with Officer Tanner. She'd overheard bits and pieces of what he was saying to her mom in the other room, and though she didn't fully understand all the details, she could tell the conversation had been serious. When Marcus finally returned to the living room, he smiled gently at Tiana, settling down beside her. So, he began, his voice soft, I had a talk with Officer Tanner today. Tiana shifted, her eyes wide with curiosity. What did she say? Marcus took a deep breath. She said she didn't mean to hurt you. She thought she was doing her job, but I reminded her that doing her job means respecting everyone, no matter who they are. Tiana nodded, hugging her blanket closer. Do you think she'll be different now? Do you think she understands? Marcus considered her question, his gaze thoughtful. I think she's starting to understand, he replied slowly. Change doesn't happen overnight, but I believe she's realized she made a mistake. And sometimes, realizing you made a mistake is the first step to becoming better. Tiana nodded, looking down at her hands. It was scary, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I kept thinking, what if you didn't come? What if she took me somewhere, and I never got to tell you? Marcus wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. That was never going to happen, sweetheart. I would always find you. I'd never stop looking. A tear slipped down Tiana's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. I know, but it still feels unfair. Why did she think I was bad just because I was in a different neighborhood? That's a question a lot of people ask. Marcus replied, his voice tinged with sadness. Sometimes people see others as different, and instead of being curious or kind, they make judgments. But those judgments don't define you, Tiana. You know who you are, and so do I. They sat together in silence, Tiana resting her head against his shoulder, finding comfort in the familiar scent of his cologne and the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For the first time since the incident, a sense of peace washed over her. She was safe, and she was understood. Her dad believed in her, and he was fighting to make sure she, and everyone like her, could feel that same sense of safety and belonging. After a while, Marcus spoke again. I wanted you to know that Officer Tanner is going to take extra training. We're going to work on making sure things like this don't happen again. And I think she may apologize to you in person. She has a lot of work to do to earn back trust, and that's going to take time. Tiana considered this, her young mind trying to grasp the weight of forgiveness. If she does say she's sorry, she began hesitantly. I think I would forgive her, because I don't want to be angry forever. And if she really is trying to be better, maybe that's a good thing. Marcus looked at her with admiration, pride swelling in his chest. That's incredibly brave of you, Tiana. You have a big heart, and that's a strength. Just know that you don't have to forgive anyone you don't feel ready to. That's your choice. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Thanks, Dad. I think I'll know when I'm ready. They stayed close on the couch, each finding comfort in the other's presence. Marcus knew there were challenges ahead, both for his department and for Tiana, but he also knew they would face them together. And with that knowledge, the heaviness of the past day began to lift, replaced by a quiet hope for a more understanding future. The next morning, as Marcus arrived at the police station, he was greeted by a small gathering outside, a mix of concerned community members, activists, and a few reporters holding microphones. Word of the incident with Tiana and Officer Tanner had spread, and the townspeople had come out in support of change. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Racial Bias" were held high, and conversations buzzed around him as he made his way toward the entrance. "Chief Green," called a reporter from the local paper, hurrying over with a notepad. "Do you have any comment on the incident involving your daughter and Officer Tanner?" Marcus paused, facing the small crowd. He had expected this day would come, though he hadn't anticipated it happening so quickly. He looked out at the people gathered, some faces familiar, others new, and took a deep breath before he spoke. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "First, I want to acknowledge what happened to my daughter, Tiana. Like every other child in Willowbrook, she deserves to feel safe and respected in her community, regardless of where she's riding her bike, who her family is, or the color of her skin." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and he could see people nodding in support. "What happened was unacceptable," he continued, his gaze scanning the crowd. "It shouldn't have happened to Tiana, and it shouldn't happen to anyone else. We are taking immediate steps to address this within the department. This includes new training focused on recognizing and eliminating implicit bias, and stricter policies to ensure that every officer is held accountable for their actions." One of the activists, a woman named Felicia Grant, stepped forward, her eyes searching. "And what about Officer Tanner, Chief? Will there be real consequences for her?" Marcus nodded, understanding the crowd's skepticism. "Officer Tanner is being placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full review of her actions. She'll undergo training and will be monitored closely if she returns to active duty. This is about more than one officer. It's about changing the culture that allows these biases to go unchecked." A young man near the front spoke up, his voice firm. "Chief, with all due respect, we've heard promises before. How can we trust that things will actually change?" Marcus looked him in the eyes, feeling the weight of his question. "I understand the doubt," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "Change can be slow, and trust takes time to rebuild. But I can promise you this. As long as I'm the police chief of Willowbrook, I'll do everything in my power to make sure we build a safer, more inclusive community. I want every child, every family, to feel as safe here as I want Tiana to feel." The crowd fell silent, listening intently. Marcus could see the skepticism beginning to lift, replaced by a cautious hope. "We need to work together," he continued. "This can't just be on the police department. It's up to all of us to look out for one another, to speak up when we see injustice, and to hold each other accountable. Today, we start building a better Willowbrook, for Tiana and for everyone." A round of applause broke out, and Marcus felt a small surge of relief. As the crowd dispersed, he walked back toward the station, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew it would take time, effort, and commitment from everyone involved, but he was ready to lead by example. Inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Tiana. "How did it go?" Marcus smiled, replying with a quick, "It went well. People are ready for change." Tiana's reply came almost immediately. "Good. We'll make sure it happens." Marcus felt a swell of pride. His daughter had shown remarkable strength, and now, thanks to her courage, Willowbrook was taking its first steps toward a future where everyone could feel respected and safe. Over the following weeks, Willowbrook felt the ripple effects of Tiana's experience. The police department's internal review of Officer Tanner's actions had begun, and while Tiana tried to move forward, the memory of that evening still lingered, especially as discussions about it spread through the town. Marcus had become a central figure in these conversations, balancing his role as a father with his responsibility as police chief. One afternoon, Marcus was called into a meeting with the department's internal affairs team, tasked with reviewing Officer Tanner's behavior and making a recommendation. As he sat in the conference room, He listened to the team present their findings and outline possible disciplinary actions. Chief Green, began Tom Rogers, the head of internal affairs. We've reviewed Officer Tanner's body cam footage, her reports, and witness statements from the community. There's no doubt she acted improperly, allowing personal bias to cloud her judgment. This isn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger issue we need to address. Marcus nodded, his face impassive, but his thoughts racing. He had known the review would be thorough, but hearing it confirmed added a weight to his shoulders. His mind flashed back to Tiana's face that night, her fear, her confusion, and he felt his resolve harden. Given the severity of her actions and the impact on the community, we're recommending that Officer Tanner undergo comprehensive retraining, Rogers continued. This includes not only anti-bias training, but a full psychological evaluation and mentorship with a senior officer upon her return. Another member of the team, a woman named Sandra Perez, added, "There's also the option of suspension without pay or, if deemed necessary, termination. We want to take the community's concerns seriously, but we also believe in the chance for growth and improvement. If Tanner can demonstrate real commitment to change, she could eventually earn back her position." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "My main concern is that we make it clear that there are real consequences for actions like these. The community needs to know we're committed to doing what's right, and that means holding ourselves accountable." Rogers nodded. "Understood, Chief. We're also planning a series of community events to rebuild trust and offer transparency about how the department is handling this. We want people to see that we're listening and that we're ready to make changes." With the recommendations decided, the meeting adjourned, and Marcus found himself standing in the hallway, his mind swirling with thoughts. He knew that the path forward would be challenging, but he felt a sense of reassurance knowing that his department was taking the issue seriously. Still, there was one more conversation he needed to have. He drove home that evening and found Tiana waiting for him on the porch, her expression serious. She had been asking about the investigation, eager to know how her experience was impacting the department and her town. "Dad, did they figure out what's going to happen?" she asked as he joined her on the steps. Marcus took a seat beside her, placing an arm around her shoulders. "Yes, they did. Officer Tanner is going to face consequences. She'll have to go through training and evaluations, and she may even face suspension." Tiana nodded, absorbing his words carefully. "Do you think she'll be different? Do you think she'll actually change?" Marcus considered her question thoughtfully. "I hope so, Tiana. People can change, but they have to want it. This experience has shown her, and all of us, that we need to do better. And it's a reminder that we can't ignore problems like this. We have to keep working to make things right." Tiana seemed to relax slightly, leaning against him. "I'm glad. I just want people to understand, you know? I want everyone to feel safe." Marcus smiled, pulling her close. "And that's what we're working toward. It might take time, but every step we take is making Willowbrook a better place." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the sun began to set over the neighborhood. Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that their efforts would lead to real change. And as he sat there with his daughter by his side, he knew that together, they were building a stronger, more just community. In the weeks following the internal review, the Green family found a new rhythm as they began to heal. Tiana had returned to her daily routine, though she was more thoughtful, her innocence slightly tempered by her experience. She still rode her bike, but Marcus noticed she never went far alone anymore, preferring to stay close to home or ride alongside friends. One evening, as Marcus finished up a call in his home office, he heard soft footsteps outside the door. Tiana poked her head in, her expression tentative. "Hey, Dad," she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus immediately set his work aside. "Always. What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Tiana came in and sat across from him, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shirt. She seemed to be searching for the right words, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've been thinking about Officer Tanner," she began. "You know, about how she's going to have training and all that. And do you think that's really enough?" Marcus leaned forward, taking her question seriously. "Well, I think it's a start, Tiana. Real change takes time, and sometimes People need a chance to understand their mistakes before they can change for the better. Tiana nodded slowly, her gaze distant as she thought it over. I know that makes sense, but sometimes it's hard. I just don't get why she thought I was so different, why she thought I was bad when I was just riding my bike. Marcus's heart ached as he listened to her, wishing he could shield her from the complexities of the world. It's hard for anyone to understand, sweetheart. What you went through was unfair, and no one should ever be treated like that. But one thing I know for sure is that you're not the problem. She was, and she's learning now that there are consequences for making those kinds of assumptions. Tiana looked down at her hands, then back up at her father, her eyes filled with quiet strength. I'm glad we're making changes. I want people to know they don't have to be scared just because someone looks at them like that. And I want to feel safe too. Marcus smiled gently. And that's exactly why we're doing all of this, to make sure you and everyone else can feel safe. You help make that happen. Tiana, your bravery is inspiring real change. A small, hopeful smile crossed Tiana's face, and she let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. I hope it works, Dad. I hope everyone feels that way someday. He reached across the desk, placing a hand over hers. With people like you in the world, I believe that's possible. That night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, there was a new lightness in the air, a feeling of unity and quiet resilience. Camille made Tiana's favorite meal, and the family laughed and shared stories, leaning on one another in a way that was stronger than ever before. Later, as they sat in the living room, Camille looked over at Marcus and Tiana, her eyes shining. I'm so proud of both of you, she said softly. Marcus for being the kind of leader our community needs, and Tiana for being so brave and standing up for what's right. Tiana smiled, reaching for her mom's hand. I had to be brave. You and Dad taught me that. The family sat together in a peaceful silence, each of them feeling the quiet strength that came from facing challenges together. Tiana felt a sense of pride, knowing she had helped make her community a safer place. She knew that healing would take time, but she also knew she was surrounded by love, and that love would be the foundation for everything they built moving forward. Several weeks after the incident, the Willowbrook Community Center held a gathering, inviting residents, local officials, and police officers to come together and discuss ways to improve trust and inclusivity in their town. Marcus had suggested the event, and the mayor quickly supported it, recognizing it as a crucial step toward healing the community. The Green family arrived early, with Tiana by her father's side, a little nervous but determined to be there. The room filled quickly, and as people settled into their seats, Marcus glanced around, feeling a surge of pride and hope. Tiana's experience had sparked something important. Conversations that were once avoided were now being discussed openly, with a focus on creating lasting change. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he approached the front, his gaze sweeping across the audience. He could see familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and neighbors, alongside those he didn't know as well. But all were listening, their attention focused on him. Thank you all for coming, Marcus began, his voice calm but full of conviction. Tonight is about healing, but it's also about progress. We're here to make sure that what happened to my daughter, Tiana, doesn't happen again, to her or to anyone else in this community. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Trust is the foundation of a strong community, he continued. But trust is earned, and right now I know that many of you feel that trust has been broken. My commitment, as your police chief and as a father, is to do everything in my power to restore it. We've already taken steps within the department to address biases, but there's much more work to be done. He looked over at Tiana, who was sitting in the front row beside Camille, her face thoughtful. And that work starts with listening to each other, to our children, and to everyone who calls Willowbrook home. Tonight, I want us to talk openly, to share our concerns and our hopes. Because only by understanding one another can we create a community where everyone feels safe and valued. As he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a sense of relief. He took his seat beside Tiana, who leaned over, her voice barely a whisper. That was good, Dad. People need to hear this. He smiled, squeezing her hand. Thanks, Tiana. I'm just glad you're here with me. The evening continued with heartfelt discussions, where residents shared their own experiences and ideas for building a more inclusive community. People talked about wanting more programs for kids, better representation in the police department, and more opportunities for officers to engage with residents outside of law enforcement. Toward the end of the evening, Mayor Brooks called Tiana up to the front, wanting her to share a few words. Tiana's eyes widened in surprise, but after a reassuring nod from her dad, she rose and walked to the microphone. Her small hands gripped the edge of the podium, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I'm Tiana," she began, looking out at the sea of faces with a mixture of nervousness and pride. "Some of you know me, and some of you might not. But I'm here because I had something happen to me that was really scary. And my dad told me that when things like that happen, you shouldn't keep them quiet." A quiet hush fell over the room as Tiana took a breath, gathering her courage. "I just want everyone to feel safe here, no matter who they are. I want to be able to ride my bike anywhere and feel like I belong. And I hope that we can all be kinder to each other, even if we don't always understand each other right away." The crowd broke into applause, and Tiana smiled shyly, glancing at her father. Marcus's heart swelled with pride as he watched her return to her seat, her face glowing with newfound confidence. After the event, many people approached Tiana, thanking her for speaking out and telling her how brave she was. She met each one with a smile, feeling a warmth that she hadn't felt in weeks. That night, as they returned home, the Green family felt a sense of peace, knowing that, together, they had taken a meaningful step toward creating a better future for Willowbrook. As the weeks turned into months, the changes Marcus had pushed for began to take root. Officer training sessions became regular occurrences, with a focus not only on implicit bias, but on community engagement and empathy. Willowbrook's police department implemented new procedures for transparency, inviting community members to participate in discussions and giving them a voice in shaping local policing practices. The effect was visible. Officers started participating in town events, organizing bike safety workshops, and showing up at schools to talk with kids about safety, respect, and the role of police in the community. Slowly but surely, trust began to grow. One sunny afternoon, Tiana and her family attended a community fair organized by the police department. Booths lined the park, each one focused on different aspects of safety and community building. Officers handed out bike helmets and safety gear, and children of all ages darted between the booths, laughing and sharing cotton candy and snow cones. Marcus was in his element, chatting with residents and colleagues as he mingled with the crowd. Tiana watched him from afar, her heart swelling with pride as she saw how much her father's efforts had transformed the community. She knew he had fought hard to make these changes, both for her and for the entire town. As she wandered through the booths, she spotted a familiar face. Officer Lydia Tanner stood by a small table set up for safety tips, handing out pamphlets and answering questions. Her posture was different from the last time Tiana had seen her. She looked more relaxed, her expression open and kind as she interacted with residents. For a moment, Tiana considered turning away, but something inside her urged her to approach. She took a deep breath and walked over, stopping a few feet from Lydia. Officer Tanner noticed her and gave a hesitant smile. "Hi, Tiana," she said, her voice warm but careful. "It's good to see you here." Tiana nodded, searching for the right words. "Hi, Officer Tanner." She paused, her gaze steady. "I just wanted to say that I forgive you." Lydia's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. "Tiana," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you. That means more than you know. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day, and I realize now how wrong I was. I promise I'm working to be better." Tiana nodded, a small, understanding smile on her face. "That's all I wanted, for people to be better." With that, she turned and walked back toward her family, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Forgiving Officer Tanner wasn't easy, but it felt right, and she knew her dad would be proud. As she rejoined her parents, Camille wrapped an arm around her, leaning down to whisper, "I saw what you did, honey. That was very brave." Tiana smiled, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I just thought if she's trying to change, then maybe I should too." As the sun began to set over the park, the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. The Green family sat together on a bench, watching as children ran around. Officers handed out balloons, and neighbors shared stories and laughter. Tiana glanced up at her father. "Do you think things will stay like this, Dad?" Marcus looked down at her, his eyes full of warmth and hope. "I think we've made a good start, and as long as we keep working together, I believe this is just the beginning." With that, Tiana felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her experience had sparked real change, not just for her, but for everyone in Willowbrook. And as she sat there, surrounded by the people she loved and the community she was helping to build, she knew that, together, they could create a safer, more compassionate future. Thank you for watching this story about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. We hope it inspired you to reflect on the power of kindness, fairness, and speaking out against injustice. If you believe in creating safer, more inclusive communities, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring awareness and inspire positive change. Together, let's keep spreading hope and making a difference.